friends, welcome to One Day One Answer initiative of GS Core, and today's subject is international relations. Theme that we have adopted today is impact of policies of developed and developing countries upon India. So in terms of this particular theme, impact of the policies of other countries on India, what should be your line of thinking? What should be your line of thinking? What points you should recall? So basically what you should do is, in the first instance, it is necessary for you to specify the policy, to define and specify the policy. For example, if the policy is string of pearls of China, then you have to define, you have to mention that strategy, that particular strategy, and specify about it. When I say define, mention the objective of the policy in one line. Second thing, it has to be also specified as to which country is adopting the strategy. Alright, third thing, to an extent provide the origin and the reason. ठीक है, objective तो ठीक है, but also origin and the reason why that policy has come up in historical context. So one line on historical context. So these are the three primary things that will go initially, and these are also the triggering points upon which you have to calibrate while writing an answer upon policies of other countries affecting India. Alright, then when you talk about the impact that this policy will have on India, so what are the parameters on which you will take into consideration the impacts? So impact first and foremost will be economic. First impact that you will take into consideration will be economic. For example, trade in relations between India and that country, tariffs between India and that country, investment opportunities that may be affected or that may be created, and economic cooperation that we could expect to grow or reduce because of a particular policy. For example, Russia's Far East policy. Dekho, all the policies are not negative. Russia's Far East policy, what it does is, it promotes Indian investment in that particular country and promotes economic cooperation between India and Russia. So do not think of it that all the policies, the questions that are asked on policies, they are all negative. It is not so. It is basically not so. So first is obviously economic relations. Second will be security relations. Security relations. What impact basically a country's policy will have on India's security? For example, again, if I take India's China's string of pearls policy, it is a threat to India's maritime security. Alright, so you have to, in that particular zone of security paradigm, in the zone of security paradigm, what you have to take into consideration? Border security of India, regional stability, cyber security to a certain extent, alright, maritime security. All these points will be aligned to, basically will be aligned to the paradigm of security. Third will be diplomatic impact. Diplomatic impact that a policy might have, whether be it bilateral relations, impact on bilateral relations, or it may be impact on multilateral relations, or it may be India standing in world bodies like United Nations. And lastly, I would say cultural impact. When I say cultural impact, more or less it is oriented towards Indian diaspora, people to people ties, with respect to enhancement of human resources, all those sort of things. So these are the four parameters on which impact can be measured of a country's policy. Okay. You also have to take into consideration, this I should have written earlier, but you also have to evaluate if the policy is positive or negative. If the policy basically is positive or negative, that also has to be mentioned. Other than that, what will come into play? India's response. Alright, India's response to a policy. Now remember, when you talk about policy of a country affecting India, na, it may not be directly targeting India, it may not be directly concerning India, but it may happen that it will have some impact on the other, and it does happen. Okay? In a globalized world, any policy of the country to a certain extent will affect any other country, even if it is not directly targeted towards the country. So India's response. Alright, India's response also has to be taken into consideration. In India's response, you have to basically write your answers according to the objectives of Indian foreign policy. Alright, so you have to bring in first and foremost diplomatic measures that India will put in place, or India will basically adopt for the purpose of you know for the purpose of ill effects of that policy not affecting India, और positives of those policies being enhanced. ठीक है, अगर ill effects है तो कैसे उसको कम करें. If the policy is positive, how that particular policy, how the effectiveness of that particular policy has to be increased. So their diplomatic efforts will come into play. All right. Second is in terms of negative policies. Na, in terms of negative policies. Acha, in diplomatic measures, na, take into consideration bilateral talks between India and that particular country, or take into consideration and also take into consideration multilateral talks, which may happen on platform of any particular, international organization or regional organization. For example, India and Pakistan. ठीक है, relations between India and Pakistan, they are spoken, कितना भी avoid करो, but they are spoken about in assemblies of SAARC, or recently as we saw Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Problems between us and Pakistan are spoken on international forums. All right. So how India will engage bilaterally, how India will engage multilaterally to sort out the issue. And multilaterally may specifically mention about the platforms that are being used, the platforms basically that are being used or that may be used. Other than that, protective measures. If the policy is negative, what will be protective measures of India? What will be basically protective measures of India for the purpose of avoiding the ill effects? For example, using our defense forces, ठीक है, using our defense forces. For example, using the aid of other countries, ठीक है, take into consideration Afghanistan. For the purpose of India maintaining its presence in Afghanistan, what does India do? India engages with Central Asian countries, India engages with Russia, the countries that have depth in Afghanistan, ठीक है, that have basically depth in Afghanistan, that have worked more than India in that particular region. All right. So in protective measures, what you have to do is you have to take into consideration responses that can be provided through defense forces. Obviously, war should not be your, ठीक है, if there is ill effect, war basically should not be your first measure. Other is reciprocal policy, ठीक है. If a particular policy is adopted by a country towards India, can India adopt a similar policy towards that country? For example, Canada, what it did was it accused Indian High Commissioner, one of the Indian High Commissioners, of being part of a murder, ठीक है, being part of an assassination. What did India do? It responded by expelling Canadian diplomats. So reciprocating to a particular policy has to also be taken into consideration. And last, as I told, multilateral forums. Even if we are not talking directly to that country with respect to the issue, we must be talking, but what can be done is to solve the issue, we may take help of other countries. We may basically take help of other countries, other forums. Alright, so that will also be part of your answer. So this was about framework that has to be used by you. Now let us get into actual PYQ. So this question was asked by UPSC. And what does this question demand? What is this question? The question reads, in what ways would the ongoing US-Iran nuclear pact controversy affect the national interest of India? How does India respond to this situation? How should India respond to this situation? So the policy is of US and Iran with respect to nuclear policy of Iran, है ना? but it affects India. So it is asking how does it affect India, and second is what should India do? What should India do in such circumstances? So what will be your answer? As I told you now, in the initial part, specify the policy. All right. So Iran is oriented towards nuclear research. US accuses it of creating nuclear grade weapons grade uranium. ठीक है, and that has led to a standoff between the two countries. And that has led to breakdown of the nuclear deal between US and Iran. All right. For India, this particular situation is critical, as India has to calibrate a response that will not harm its national interest. India has to calibrate a response that will basically not harm its national interest. That should be your introduction about the policy. What is the issue of that policy? Okay? And then what India will be doing. That is more than enough. Then we basically come to how India's interest will be affected. How basically India's interest will be affected. The first point obviously is energy security of India. Iran is one of the major suppliers of oil to India. And if US and Iran nuclear deal, if it breaks down, it has broken down. The question was asked when it had not broken down. So I am talking from that context. So if nuclear deal between Iran and US breaks down, what will basically happen is it will be difficult for India to purchase oil from Iran due to US sanctions. Second is Chabar port. Chabar is an ambitious project of India which will connect India to Central Asia and Russia through International North-South Transport Corridor. Breaking down of deal between US and Iran, it will lead to difficulties for India investing in that particular project, and that particular project being of any assistance to India. It will affect the regional stability. Again, it is not good for India. Regional stability will be affected. It may lead to confrontation between Iran and US or allies of US in the region. Okay. Now what will be India's response? What will be basically India's response to it? So in India's response, first is diplomatic engagement through which India has to see to it that disagreement between the two countries does not reach a bypass, does not basically reach an impasse. And second is, even if the deal between US and Iran breaks down, India has to see to it that its interests are not affected by carefully balancing its relation between US and Iran. So India has to see to it that it does not deteriorate its relations with either Iran or US through its diplomatic efforts. Second is India has to find for alternative source of energy. India has to look for alternative source of energy. So as India did in the later times also, what it did was it increased its import of oil or hydrocarbons from Russia. All right. In that way, even if India finds it difficult to import oil from Iran, its energy security will not be basically challenged, or it will not be in danger. Okay. Last will be to see to it that regional stability is not harmed. So regional cooperation, due to India's influence in the region, what India has to do is it has to work towards better regional cooperation between the countries, so that the area from West Asia to South Asia, West Asia to Central Asia does not turn into a war zone, does not turn into a casualty. That is also responsibility of India, and it will protect India's objectives. It will protect India's positioning. Alright, so this is the answer, and more or less questions on policies have to be dealt in such a format only. We have discussed the points that you have to take into consideration. I have also demonstrated the answer that you will basically write. Alright, I have also demonstrated the answer that you will basically write for a PYQ. एक PYQ हमने discuss किया. Now it is expected from you, the question that we provide, you write answer to it and send it to us. Thank you so much. Bye.